I'm going to show you how to close the shoulder seams and do a really super duper neckline. And here you can see what my bias binding will look like. We'll have the bias to the outside. It's nice and slim, and on the inside you just get these two stitching lines. And I'm using the matte side of my silk satin to bind the neckline. So the first step is to sew together the shoulder seams, and then we're also going to sew together our bias binding. And here we're going to put the left sides on top of each other so that we have the matte side to the outside. And then we're going to iron the bias binding lengthways in half before we sew it together. When you're ironing it in half, you also want to use your tailor's clapper to ensure that you get a really neat, sharp edge. So lots of steam. Take off the iron and put the clapper on straight away, press down a little bit, and you get a very pristine edge to your bias binding, and then it's much easier to work with, particularly if you're using, say, a polyester where it's kind of hard to get the edges in. That makes good sense to use the clapper. And we do that all the way to the end. And now we're going to put our bias binding together. Make sure that one side overlaps a bit when you start so that the ends actually sit and give you a continuous line. There you go. That's how it should look. And then we also pin our shoulder seams. The right sides need to be on the inside, of course. The back slightly wider than the front, so we're holding in a couple of millimeters. It's not very much, and it helps to have vertical pins going in there rather than horizontal pins. So let's sew this together now. Put it under the machine and secure with a few stitches. Remove your first vertical pin. And then here I didn't have one in from the start, and I had to put it in now because it really does make good sense. And then it's easy to hold in whatever there is to hold in. It will be very little and there will be no issue holding that in. And that's my beautiful little seam. Very nice. Next we're going to sew together our bias binding, and seam allowance you can take foot width here, really it doesn't matter. And once you've sewn it, you will iron it apart and then trim your seam allowances. Overlock the edges of the shoulder seams, and then we want to iron those towards the back in one go. Great. That looks really good. Now we want to quarter the bias binding and the neckline, and we're going to start where we have joined the bias binding together, and we go halfway of that here, and then we mark directly the opposite side, and then after that we mark the two other sides so that we've got 4 quarters. There we go. And now we need to repeat the same thing on the actual top. We can mark the center front and the center back. That's pretty obvious. So put the shoulder seams together, then there's the center front. You don't necessarily need to mark that because we have a very pronounced V-neck, but you can do. I do. And then we do the same on the center back. Line there. And then we put the center front and the center back on top of each other, and we were going to see, what the center is of that. And it is not the shoulder seam. In fact, it is a 1 centimeter off the shoulder seam. So don't just go by that. You need to do this and then mark that point. And I'm also marking it on the other side. There we go. And then you just need to make sure that it's the same. There we go. Looks good to me. So now I've marked my 4 points on the top and my 4 points on the bias binding. I can start putting them together and aligning those markings. Where I have got the seam, I'm going to start at the center back, and I put it against the wrong side of the fabric. And I use a vertical pin for that, and then I also put it on the front and align that with the center front marking. And you can move the center front down a little bit so that when you are turning it in or turning it over, there's no tension there. So go about 4 millimeters lower and pin it in. In fact, I think we need a vertical pin here again so that we don't have to remove it and it just stays in place. So I'm just swapping my needle around like that, and then that's marked. Next, we're going to do the not quite shoulder seams. So it's about 1 centimeter off, we know that. So align those marks on both shoulders. And then we can go over to the sewing machine and sew that in. I wouldn't put any more pins in because they're more hindering than they are positive. So just those 4 points is important, and then the rest you do on the sewing machine. There's only really 1 point when you're sewing this on where it could stretch, where it's not straight grain, and that is in the shoulder area, about 5 centimeters down from this shoulder area. So you want to make sure that you don't pull the fabric off the top in that area, and you're just stretching your bias binding a little bit. And then you line up the folded edge of the bias binding with the presser foot, and that's way more important than the distance you have from the seam to the rough edge of the fabric, right? Because that will be cut back anyway, so it really doesn't matter. It's important, however, that the presser foot sits right on that edge, because that distance is what's going to remain, and that distance is what's going to be turned over and stitched down. So that will make your bias binding look really, really even. So make sure that you stick to that outside line. And then you just sew all the way around, and your left hand moves the fabric into position. You make sure that there is no pull on it, that there's no little pleats. So just flatten the fabric out with your left hand and keep moving it around, and your right hand ensures that the bias binding is fed in very straight into the presser foot while you go round. There you go. And there we are, almost at the end, just a little bit more. And now we're coming towards the point where we have our little V dip. And because we don't want this to be too round, what we're going to do is sew right to that vertical needle, right on it, and then you're going to put the needle down in the fabric so that we can then move the fabric round. So needle down, remove the vertical pin, lift the presser foot up again, and then move the fabric round, and that'll give you a really nice V. Actually, it'll be a soft V. Just make sure that you don't pull your top in that area that goes up to the shoulder, because there we have a slight bias in the fabric. There we go, all done. We've got it in. Just check that you have caught the V dip, and then you can cut off your threads and trim your seam allowance. When you trim your seam allowance, you want to leave at least 3 millimeters standing so that you can stitch on it, because we will take that seam and we're going to push it into the top and top stitch that down. And if there's nothing left and it'll fray, then that's no good. And you can see here the line that we're going to get. So basically the bias is going to be completely flat, and it's the top that turns. So fold it over like that. And then when we're done, we're just going to fold over the bias binding and stitch that down. You can iron this, but the understitching is actually one step that will make sure that you don't have to go and get up and iron And it's done in industry a lot for that. It makes everything more stable also. So I am not going to press it. You can do it, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go straight to the sewing machine, and from the top of the fabric, from the outside, I'm going to stitch the bias binding onto the top. And that gives me a really firm edge to turn the whole thing in. When you turn it over, your stitching will literally prevent the top from rolling out. So it'll all be in the same place, and then when you fold over the bias, it'll be the same distance all the way around. Now we're ready to do the top stitching, and you want to take stitch length 3, and you're going to get a beautiful result. You want to stitch fairly much on the edge. Don't want to come in too much to the middle here. That doesn't look nice. You want to be right on the edge, and stitch length 3. So because it's easy to slip off this, you will have to look at your needles. Your eye will kind of go to and fro between the fixed point on your presser foot that you line up with and the needle, because sometimes it will slip off if you don't watch it. And then you feed the bias straight into the foot, so you never come at it at an angle. You want to do it really straight, and keep watching where you're going. Basically go all the way around, and you will have a really beautiful neckline. Perfect. So nice. Just keep moving the fabric down. Don't let it push or pull so you end up with pleats or you know, that really unsightly pulls in it. It needs to be really flat. And there we go. We've come around. That's so nice. Nothing will replace really beautifully done bias binding. You cannot buy stuff and get this result. Beautiful. Lock in your stitches, and now we have finished the neckline. All we have to do is give it a jolly good press, as we always do. Make sure you have your tailor's clapper handy. You put lots of steam in here, put your clapper on top of it, and you'll get a really neat and sharp finish, especially if you're not working with pure silk like I am here, where actually creases stay in quite well. If you're working with a polyester, you really need it. And there you go, one beautiful neckline. Now we finished the neckline, which I think was the hardest part. The next step is to close our side seams, and then we can also bind the armholes. See you there.